The insult wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just enough for everyone nearby to hear. Bruce Lee didn't interrupt. He let the sentence finish. The room was ordinary. Wooden floors worn smooth by repetition. High windows letting in a slow wash of late afternoon light that settled across the walls in long rectangles. Dust moved quietly in the air when someone shifted their weight. The space didn't feel ceremonial. It felt used, practiced in. A few students leaned against the edges of the room, backs resting against the wall as if they had been there for hours. Some sat cross-legged on the floor, hands resting loosely on their knees. Others stood with relaxed shoulders, arms hanging at their sides, pretending not to look too attentive. They were listening without wanting to appear tense. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a spectacle. No banners, no crowd. Just a demonstration, a conversation about movement, efficiency, control. Bruce Lee stood near the center without claiming the space. He wasn't positioned on a raised platform. There was no spotlight effect. He simply happened to be where the room naturally oriented itself. His stance was neutral, feet grounded, posture upright but not rigid. His voice carried clearly but without force. He wasn't projecting dominance. He was explaining something small about timing, about how emotion could be shortened by a fraction and still remain complete. His hands moved only when necessary. Brief gestures, direct, then still again. There was a subtle hierarchy in the room, not announced but visible. A few senior students sat slightly closer, bodies angled toward him. Visitors stayed near the back, less certain of their place. One man in particular had chosen a position slightly off to the side, close enough to be included, far enough to observe without committing. He stood with his arms folded tightly across his chest. He had been studying the room more than the movements, watching, waiting for a gap. His expression never fully relaxed. There was something evaluative in it. Not hostile, just skeptical. When Bruce Lee paused between thoughts just long enough to breathe and shift the topic, the man stepped in casually. So this is supposed to replace real fighting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward aggressively. It sounded almost conversational, but the tone was angled. The emphasis landed on real. A faint smirk tugged at the side of his mouth. Chin lifted slightly. Not enough to provoke a confrontation, but enough to signal doubt, enough to test the temperature of the room. A few students glanced sideways without turning their heads. Someone near the window adjusted their stance. The faint sound of fabric shifting seemed louder than usual. People heard it. The insult wasn't sharp. It wasn't cruel. It was dismissive, and that's often harder to respond to. Bruce Lee didn't look at him immediately. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to clarify his point mid-sentence. He let the air settle. The man, sensing the space, continued just slightly. "It looks refined," he added, almost casually, "but I'm not sure how it holds up under pressure." Now, the silence thickened. No one laughed. No one defended. They were waiting, not to see what the insult meant, but to see what Bruce Lee would do with it. The man's words didn't echo loudly, but they lingered. "It looks refined, but I'm not sure how it holds up under pressure." He let the final word hang just a little longer than necessary, not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel intentional. No one spoke. Bruce Lee didn't shift his stance. His feet remained planted exactly where they had been. His hands stayed relaxed at his sides. He didn't tilt his head, didn't narrow his eyes, didn't respond mid-breath. He let the sentence finish. That detail mattered. Most people interrupt an insult halfway through. They correct it before it lands. They rush to repair their image before it fully absorbs into the room. He didn't. The pause that followed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was clean. 3 seconds passed, then 4. Long enough for the attention of the room to detach from Bruce Lee and settle fully on the man who had spoken. The man hadn't expected silence. He had expected friction. A quick rebuttal. maybe a sharp explanation, something to push against. Instead, he was given space. His arms, which had been folded tightly across his chest, loosened slightly. One hand dropped, then returned to his forearm. He adjusted his footing as if recalibrating his balance. Bruce Lee's face remained neutral, not blank, just attentive. He looked at the man now, fully, without tension. There was no challenge in his gaze, no irritation, just presence. And presence, when steady, makes people aware of their own tone. Someone near the front shifted on the floor, the quiet movement sounding louder than it should have. A chair leg scraped faintly against wood. The room had grown still in a way that didn't feel forced. It felt natural, like everyone instinctively understood that something small but important was unfolding. The insulter cleared his throat softly. He hadn't prepared for the silence to stretch this long. Bruce Lee inhaled once, slow and steady. Then he spoke. "If it doesn't hold under pressure," he said evenly, "then it isn't worth keeping." No emphasis, no sarcasm, no defensive explanation. Just a sentence delivered at the same volume he had been using all along. The room absorbed it. The statement didn't argue. It didn't reject the challenge. It accepted the premise without emotional attachment. The man blinked once, subtly, his chin lowered by a fraction. The smirk had faded completely now. What replaced it wasn't embarrassment. It was uncertainty, because the tone he had introduced into the room had not been returned to him. Bruce Lee continued, voice steady. "Pressure removes what is unnecessary." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't look around for validation. He didn't turn it into a lesson. He simply returned to the discussion as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had shifted. The air felt reorganized. The earlier imbalance, the slight social push, had quietly reversed. Not through force, not through dominance, through restraint. And in that restraint, the man's earlier confidence had nowhere to land. Bruce Lee didn't expand on the sentence. He didn't turn toward the room and explain what he meant. He didn't underline the point. He didn't make it heavier than it was. He simply continued. He stepped slightly to the side and gestured for one of the students to come forward. The student hesitated for half a second, aware of the shift that had just happened, then walked into the center. Bruce Lee positioned him gently, adjusted the angle of his shoulders with 2 light taps. Not corrective, just precise. "Stand naturally," he said. His tone hadn't changed from before the comment. The demonstration resumed. He showed how a straight-line motion could remove wasted movement, how reacting early wasn't always better, how small corrections mattered more than dramatic force. The room watched closely now, not because the insult had created drama, but because the contrast had sharpened attention. The man who had spoken earlier remained standing at the side. His arms were no longer folded tightly. One hand rested against his chin now, as if evaluating something more carefully. He wasn't smiling anymore. He tried once more. "Well," he said, voice more measured this time, "that still depends on the opponent, doesn't it?" There was no smirk attached to it now. No edge. It sounded more like a question than a challenge. Bruce Lee paused, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge the sound. "Yes," he said calmly. "It always does." He didn't add anything else. No elaboration, no correction. He let the agreement sit between them. That's when the imbalance became visible. Earlier, the man had been testing. Now he was adjusting. His weight shifted from one foot to the other, his shoulders lowered slightly. His posture no longer projected outward. The room felt it too. No one laughed. No one whispered. But the way people were positioned had changed. More faces were turned toward Bruce Lee. Fewer were angled toward the challenger. The hierarchy had rearranged itself quietly. Bruce Lee resumed the movement demonstration, this time slower, not to prove anything, just to show the details clearly. He absorbed the interruption and folded it into the rhythm of the room. The insulter didn't interrupt again immediately. He was watching now, not searching for gaps, just watching. The earlier tension didn't explode. It didn't collapse either. It dissolved, because there had been no emotional resistance to push against. When someone expects reaction and receives composure instead, their momentum fades, their tone softens, their certainty thins out. Bruce Lee didn't overpower the man. He didn't win an exchange. He simply stayed steady long enough for the room to recognize the difference in tone. And once that recognition happened, the balance shifted on its own. The exchange could have ended there. It didn't. Bruce Lee continued the demonstration as if nothing unusual had happened. He positioned the student in front of him and adjusted the distance between them by a few inches. Not dramatically, just enough to illustrate spacing. "Don't reach," he said quietly. "Let it come to you." His voice carried evenly through the room. No tension in it, no hint of irritation. The earlier comment still lingered in the air, but it had lost its edge. The man at the side shifted again. He wasn't folded in on himself, but he wasn't projecting outward anymore either. The casual dominance he had tried to introduce had thinned. Bruce Lee showed a small redirection of force. The student extended an arm. Bruce Lee guided it past his shoulder with minimal movement. No strain, no speed. The simplicity of it made the room lean in. The man spoke again, but this time the tone had changed. "So you're saying structure matters more than strength?" The phrasing was different. It wasn't dismissive now. It was searching. Bruce Lee glanced toward him. Just briefly. "Yes," he said. "Structure decides what strength can do." No pause for effect. No layered explanation. Just a clean answer. He returned to the student and reset the stance. There was something noticeable now. The room wasn't watching Bruce Lee to see if he would defend himself anymore. They were watching to see how he would continue. The shift was subtle but clear. The man's posture had lowered slightly. His shoulders weren't squared in challenge. His arms no longer guarded his chest. He stood with one hand resting at his side, the other hanging loosely. His earlier smirk was gone. He hadn't been embarrassed. He had been recalibrated. Bruce Lee didn't press the advantage. He didn't return to the earlier comment to close it publicly. He didn't frame it as a lesson. He simply continued. He asked the student to apply pressure more aggressively. The student did. Bruce Lee adjusted his angle by a fraction, letting the force slide past him instead of meeting it directly. "Don't fight the force," he said. "Redirect it." The line wasn't delivered as a metaphor. It was technical, but the room understood something beyond the mechanics. The man who had questioned him didn't interrupt again immediately. He watched the movement more carefully now. His chin lowered slightly. Not in defeat, in focus. The energy in the room had stabilized. Earlier, there had been a social push, a mild attempt to tilt the balance. Now the balance felt level again. Not because the insult had been crushed, but because it hadn't been engaged emotionally. Bruce Lee didn't take the comment personally. He didn't rush to protect his image. He let the room see the contrast in tone for themselves. And once that contrast became visible, no further argument was needed. The demonstration continued. The atmosphere felt quieter, not tense, just aware. By now, the earlier comment felt distant, but it hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed shape. The room was quieter than before, not stiff, not tense, just more attentive. Conversations had stopped completely. No one was shifting casually anymore. The loose, almost relaxed energy from earlier had settled into something steadier. Bruce Lee stepped back from the student and nodded once, signaling the end of that particular exchange. The student returned to the edge of the room without looking toward the man who had spoken earlier. Bruce Lee didn't scan the room for reactions. He didn't check who had approved or disapproved. He simply adjusted his stance and continued speaking about distance and timing. The man on the side remained where he was, but his presence felt different now. Earlier, he had been slightly elevated in his posture, chin raised, shoulders squared, weight evenly planted, like someone confident in their interruption. Now his stance had softened. His weight shifted to one leg. His arms stayed uncrossed. His gaze wasn't challenging anymore. It was observant. He spoke again, but carefully. "So you don't believe in fixed forms?" he asked. The tone was neutral, almost respectful. Bruce Lee looked at him directly this time. "I believe in what works," he said. "If it doesn't adapt, it breaks." There was no performance in the delivery, no attempt to make the line memorable. It was spoken the same way he had spoken everything else. But something settled in the room when he said it. Not agreement, recognition. The earlier imbalance had fully reversed. When the man first interrupted, the room had subtly tilted toward him, waiting to see if Bruce Lee would defend himself. Now the room tilted toward Bruce Lee, naturally waiting to see what he would say next. The man felt it. You could see it in the way he paused before speaking again. He had entered the conversation casually, testing authority. Now he was measuring his words. Bruce Lee didn't capitalize on it. He didn't press harder. He didn't turn the moment into a demonstration of dominance. He just kept the tone steady. That steadiness made the earlier dismissiveness look misplaced, without anyone pointing it out. A few students near the front subtly leaned forward, elbows resting on their knees. Not because of spectacle, but because attention had narrowed. The atmosphere had shifted completely. There was no visible humiliation, no public defeat, just a quiet reordering. The man who had spoken earlier now listened more than he talked. His earlier smirk was gone. His posture no longer projected control. He was present, but not leading. Bruce Lee hadn't forced the change. He hadn't corrected the insult. He hadn't asserted status verbally. He had allowed the tone to expose itself. And once exposed, it softened on its own. The room didn't need a resolution. It had already felt the reversal. The session moved toward its natural end. No announcement marked it. The energy just began to slow. Students relaxed their shoulders. Someone near the door shifted to let cooler air move through the room. A faint scrape of wood against wood echoed as a chair was nudged back into place. Bruce Lee stepped aside and spoke quietly with one of the senior students about scheduling the next session. His tone remained unchanged from the beginning, measured, calm, unhurried. The earlier comment was no longer present in the air. It had dissolved without being addressed. The man who had made it stood still for a moment, as if deciding whether to leave immediately or stay. He didn't rush out. He didn't attempt another remark. He walked forward instead. Not dramatically, not slowly, just directly. He stopped a few feet from Bruce Lee and waited until the small side conversation ended. There was no crowd forming around them. No one leaned in to witness an exchange. The man cleared his throat lightly. "So, you focus more on adaptability than tradition?" he asked. The tone was level now. No trace of the earlier smirk. No casual edge. Bruce Lee looked at him and nodded once. Yes. He didn't elaborate. He didn't reference what had happened earlier. He didn't defend the approach again. The man gave a small nod in return. Not submission, not apology, just acknowledgement. And that was enough. Around them, students began putting on their shoes. Someone laughed softly at something unrelated. The normal sounds of a room returning to routine filled the space. No one mentioned the earlier moment. They didn't need to, because what had shifted wasn't verbal. It was tonal. At the beginning, the insult had tried to tilt the room. It had introduced a small imbalance. Bruce Lee hadn't corrected it directly. He hadn't challenged it. He hadn't met it with force. He let it land. He let it finish. And in doing so, he removed its momentum. The man who had spoken didn't look exposed because he had been attacked. He looked exposed because his tone no longer matched the atmosphere. The room had adjusted without instruction. Bruce Lee gathered his belongings without urgency. He moved toward the door as the last few students lingered behind. The man stepped aside instinctively to clear the path. There was no final exchange, no concluding statement, no lesson delivered. Bruce Lee didn't need to answer the insult. The room already had.